All right, welcome to today's public lecture by Professor and New York. All right, welcome to today's public lecture by Professor and New York Times columnist John McWhorter. We are delighted that you are here. This is an event that is co-sponsored by the Maryland Language Science Center and the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. Times columnist John McWhorter. We are delighted that you are here. This is an event that is co-sponsored by the Maryland Language Science Center and the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are two communities that deeply value open discussion and the exchange of ideas. Today's event might spark a variety of opinions and perspectives, and we ask that all attendees allow the event to proceed without interruption. This ensures a positive experience for all who are here. If you wish to express yourself beyond the moderated Q&A, we ask that you do so in designated areas outside of the building. We appreciate all of you for attending and helping us create a space for sharing and creating new ideas and perspectives. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dean Stephanie Shonakin from the College of Arts and Humanities, who will lead us off with a few opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Yi-Ting Huang, who, along with other colleagues, have worked really, really hard to realize this really important event. As Yi-Ting said, I'm Stephanie Shonakin, the very proud Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. On behalf of myself and my dear colleague, Dean Susan Rivera of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, we welcome you to what I know will be a thought-provoking lecture and discussion. This event is co-sponsored by the Maryland Language Science Center, which sits in RHU and BSOS, our Linguistics Department, which sits in RHU, Hearing and Speech Sciences, which is in BSOS, and the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, which also sits in BSOS. So this is a collaborative event by our two wonderful colleges. At a time when there is so much fear of books, ideas, and knowledge, we are committed to hosting events like this that urge us to engage with each other, even on difficult topics, and to ultimately think for ourselves about the world we want to live in. So today we welcome an eminent scholar to help us think about language and its central role as an indicator of identity, belonging, and conflict, both domestically and across the world. We hope by creating a venue to unpack nuance and complexity, we can reach an understanding and appreciation of differences. Dr. John McWhorter, our scholar, is an associate professor in the Slavic Department at Columbia University. He's a linguist by training and shares his expertise and synthesis of issues related to language, race, and society as a columnist for the New York Times. I imagine there are some people here who know him from that world and others who know him from his linguistics world. He has published over 20 books, including The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English, and Woke Racism. No matter what you think of John McWhorter's views, he makes you think, and we must never be afraid to think. John knows and writes about a whole spectrum of things. I sat next to him at dinner sometime last year in Austin, Texas, part of a symposium on civil discourse, and we had a lovely chat about the subject of my dissertation, and I'm an ethnomusicologist. Like, what does he know about ethnomusicology? But he knows that too. The subject of my dissertation was an African-American opera singer called Camilla Williams, who nobody knows except me and John McWhorter. So the title of his talk this afternoon is Why Most Humans Talk in Two or More Ways. Language is one of the things that makes us human, and I suspect that this talk will remind us of our common humanity and will make us think, grapple, analyze, and maybe rethink, because ultimately, that is what we will proudly and fearlessly continue to do as an intellectual community here at the University of Maryland. So please help us welcome John McWhorter.
Thank you, folks. And thank you very much for the various organizations on campus who invited me here to speak today. And I want to discuss something which may seem kind of obvious, but isn't all the time, and give you a sense of how linguists have classified things that may seem mundane or even peculiar, or sometimes even irritating about how we speak, both to one another and even within ourselves. And what I mean by that is this. I think it's easy for us to understand that there are people who can speak two or more languages. Nobody wonders why anyone would do that. However, in terms of how we think of ourselves in real life, how we listen to other people in real life, often the case is that we can be a little bit thrown by the fact that people speak their own language in more than one way. We often think that there's some kind of artifice going on, that one of the ways is somehow less sophisticated or less good or less complex than the other, that somehow the ideal is something like what we might consider vanilla American, that you speak a standard kind of English, and other than some slang, that's pretty much what you speak, and that's the normal way that language works for human beings. You talk one way. Maybe you use some words and expressions with some other people, but the default is talking one way. And if anything else is happening, then there's something odd afoot. It's the sort of thing where you might say, "What's up with that?" And the truth is, we have a rather limited perspective in this world of standard American English. There's an awful lot that, for understandable reasons, we simply can't see. And we can understand more about ourselves if we pull the camera back and we look at what language is more often like around the world, especially apart from large, quote-unquote, developed and extremely monolingual societies such as this one. With it allowed that there are many languages spoken in America, but the general idea is that the real one, the default one, the one that anybody is expected to speak, especially after a generation, is English, and preferably a standard kind of English. That's a very artificial way of feeling. And you know what? I'll openly admit that deep down I feel that way too. It's all I've known for 59 years. But there are different ways of being a language. So what I mean is the title of this talk, which is why most humans talk in two or more ways. Most humans, not just some, most. So I want to introduce you to a concept that some of you may be familiar with, but rarely is it known by name in the real world, outside of linguistics and anthropology, and maybe sociology. And it's what linguists, since about 1959, have called diglossia. And what that means is that in many societies, it's considered perfectly ordinary that there's one way that you talk in formal contexts. Then, in informal contexts, you talk in a different way. You speak a different dialect of the general language. And it's so different that it almost is another language, and that's just considered the way life is. You grow up in it, and when you go somewhere else, you're perplexed to find that even in formal and informal situations, both, everybody talks the same way. So, for example, in Greece, there are two kinds of Greek. This is beginning to bleed together now, but until not too long ago. There was katharevousa and demotiki. Katharevousa, formal, it's in the books. And so if you wanted to say he does not sit, then you have what's there, which is roughly engafete. Now, that's in a book, that's formal, that's school. What you learn on your mother's knee, what anybody really speaks while having a glass of wine or just walking around, is something different. It's related, but different. And you don't have to know any Greek, nor do you have to know the International Phonetic Alphabet to understand that engavete is a different version from what you see right up above it. Another classic example of diglossia in the first studies of it is Switzerland. You know anybody who's Swiss, they speak three things if you're having a conversation with them. English, and then they don't just speak German. There are two things that they speak. There's the standard German, And then there's Swiss German. And Swiss German isn't just standard German except with local words for Swiss things or something like that. It's really practically a different language. Or honestly, to tell you the truth, if you roll the dice again, it's a different language. And you just toggle between the two depending on the circumstances. And so in standard German, I found money. Ich habe Geld gefunden. Ich habe Geld gefunden. But in, for example, Swiss German or Bavarian German, and they're very similar dialects, you have in Bavarian, ich ha Geld gefunden. Now you can look at the two, you don't have to know German to tell that they're related, but they're extremely, extremely different. Now, you notice I was just fudging now. I started talking about Switzerland and all of a sudden noticed that the slide had Bavaria. Well, pretend that didn't happen because here is Swiss German. And so the word for someone in standard German is jemand. Who cares? In itself, that's not interesting. But in Swiss German, the word for someone is etwa. It's a completely different word. If you're Swiss, you know two words for someone. There's jemand if you're in school. There's etwa if you're living your actual real life. Another example, Arabic. If you know anybody who says they speak Arabic, that's all they're going to say. Oh yeah, I speak Arabic. Well, if they're speaking to you, they speak three languages because there's English, and then there's modern standard Arabic that we could learn on this campus, and then there's Arabic of wherever they're actually from specifically, where the Arabic that you live your real life in is literally a different language. That's not how it feels to an Arabic speaker, and that's what's important. English. I am right now speaking pretty much the only English that I know. This is it. Wake me up, and I'm going to say, why did you wake me up? That's it. Whereas if you are an Arabic speaker, there are these two things, and you think of both of them as Arabic, but you are the equivalent of somebody who speaks both Latin and Italian, and if you ask them what they speak, they say Latin, when Italian is what they really speak ordinarily. So nose in modern standard Arabic is anf, which sounds like a nose somehow. It's like an elephant's nose. But then in Egyptian Arabic, it's manachir, and you can see that's a completely different word, both words. And manachir doesn't mean snoot or some slang word for nose. It means nose, but it's just that's what you use colloquially. Same thing with the word for what? Ma is, standard. Is what you use if you're being an Egyptian person. And so these are examples of diglossia. Now, even in academia, a certain collection of examples of this have been getting around since the Eisenhower era, but it's a much more universal phenomenon than even those classic studies or what you might pick up in one class indicate. And so, people don't walk around saying we're diglossic, but if you are in Helsinki and you decide, tragically, to try to learn some of the language, then you're going to find that the first thing Finns want to talk about is how there's what you can get from the Berlitz Guide or something like that and the way they actually talk. And it's not that the Berlitz Guide is school and the way they actually talk is some sort of, hip-hop slang. It's that even your grandmother has two ways of speaking. So do you speak Finnish? And you can see the standard, and you can see the colloquial. The colloquial tends to take it a little lighter, but you have to know how to say that. No one lives in the standard. The standard is something that you get in school or that you use with foreigners who've learned Finnish from somewhere else. They themselves speak this colloquial way. And so they'll actually say, well, if you're really going to settle in, you have to learn these things. And then you're taught all of these new ways of speaking that were not in the book. It gets extreme. It gets really extreme. I'm going to drop a name because you get around and you start noticing people, and she's been in the news lately because of what MSNBC just did to her. Alex Wagner is a television host, and she happens to be Burmese. And I met her at something about 8 years ago, and, so do you speak Burmese? And she said, yeah, but it's two things. Now, what she meant by that, she's not going to tell me it's diglossia, but what she means is that there's Burmese on paper, and then there's Burmese that you speak, and they really are completely different languages. If you know a Burmese person, they control those two things, and they think of them as one thing, and nobody bats an eye. And so, you can look at the numbers, 1, 2, and 3. Well, there's the high, that's what H stands for. There's the L, and that's what the low, that stands for low. Now, those are not fair definitions. They're used in the literature. High makes it sound like it's better. Let's just say high as in terms of formality. Low doesn't mean that there's something wrong with colloquial and vernacular settings. But just look at the numbers for 1, 2, and 3 that you would learn in a course on Burmese, and then look at what people actually say, which are really completely different words. The case of 3 in particular, so formally, sung, and then informally, tong. Those are completely different words. And the same with die, so somebody passed away, somebody died, and you can look at those words and they're completely different. That's perfectly ordinary. That's common in languages in that part of the world. And it's important to know that the L is not always less complex than the H. Just as often, it's actually, depending on what metric you use, the more complicated way of speaking. And so, for example, in Britain, there's a region called Cornwall. It's in the west. And there used to be a dialect of English spoken in Cornwall. It was called Cornwall English. And it was very different from the standard. It's extinct now. I wish it weren't because it was only studied so much. But here was an English that was completely different from anything that we would ever know. So, for example, if you are an English speaker and that's all you grew up with, one of the most frustrating things about learning a foreign language when you're in some class is that if it's a European language, you've got these damn genders. You have to split nouns into masculine and feminine for no real reason. And so el sombrero, the hat, is male. La luna, the moon, is a woman. And you just have to know. And with Spanish, it's pretty easy because you can pretty much depend on o and a, and then there are a handful of exceptions. But in French, it's hard. In German, it's brutal. You really just, you have to know. Cornwall English still had that. And so you can look at it, and it just looks like some words were kind of ugly and strange, but there's this stone, and there's that stone. Okay. But if it was a tree, it was vast tree and thick tree. What that was the masculine gender versus the common gender. And as you can see, with trees and stones, you kind of just had to know. Yes, there's something kind of alive about trees, and so maybe that makes it the one that's animate. But if you look at other words, it really didn't make much sense. But it meant that with a tree, you'd say he's cut down. But with a stone, it's dried up. I never noticed that until right now. Nobody would say that the stone is dried up. I don't know what that is. Let's just say that the sentence is, it's very hard, or it's rolling, or something like that. So he's cut down, the stone, it's rolling. It still had gender. Or look at this sentence here. Dedum digi arno. Dedum digi arno. It's a very ordinary sentence. And you look at it and you think, well, what in the world did any of that mean? Yet it was actually not only ordinary English, but it had a complication that we don't have in standard English. So it's, did he dig regularly or not? So first of all, is he, dedum. Now then you see diggy, and you're thinking, well, it must be some affectionate form of the word dig. Like there he was a-digging or something. No, it's not that. The E meant regularly. And so, dedum dig arno would have meant, did he dig that hole yesterday? Dedum digi arno means, was he regularly in the habit of digging? We don't have an equivalent of this E. We would have just left that to context. And that's because Cornwall English was more complicated. The sentence down here below, I'm not going to go over, but what it meant was Billy at home did have a tendency to go with his sister. Completely different way of putting it, much busier than the standard. So that's diglossia. Diglossia is all over the world. And when you see it, there are always certain parameters of usage. And so, which is formal, the H or the L? It's the H. What do you use in actual normal conversation? Well, that's the L. What has prestige? You can guess. What do you learn natively on your mother's or your father's knee? That's the L. What's standardized in books? H. What do people say is soulful? Probably the L. What do people say is beautiful? usually it's going to be the H. It's that kind of thing. And so formality, roughly, the formal being different from what you actually learn under normal circumstances. Now, why does that happen? Well, the truth is, the real question is, why does it not? And so, a question that I could ask is, why was that movie in color? And then you're thinking, isn't that a little 1936? The real question is, why was that movie in black and white? What was that silent film they made about 12 years ago? It was called Happy Black and White French Movie, whatever it was. Why did they make it in black and white? That's the question. But if we're going to talk about causes of diglossia, there are all sorts of things that happen. In other words, everything, everywhere, very natural stuff. The question is why it doesn't happen. So sometimes there's a language that's imposed on people who don't speak it natively. That happens, unfortunately, often. And as a result, in Haiti, there is French itself, and then Haitian Creole, which happens when African enslaved people have to learn French very quickly and nobody cares. That's Haitian Creole, so you have a diglossia there. Arabic has so many different flavors as in different languages because the original language, modern standard Arabic, was imposed on, for example, the original people living in North Africa, the Berbers, or if you go further south, the original people living in Sudan, etc. And so you end up having two Arabics, the one that is in, for example, the Quran, which is what preserves modern standard Arabic and keeps it in modern times, and then you have all these other new languages, and people use them side by side. That's something that happens everywhere all the time. Sometimes the H variety is just made up, because there's often a feeling that there needs to be something that's big and beautiful and that everybody speaks, as opposed to a bunch of local varieties. And so with German, standard German is something, it's oversimplified but useful to say that Martin Luther made it up, and people now use it. The other Germans, the 36 other Germans, which are now considered the L varieties, those are what really happened. Same thing with Greek. Or there are other times, kind of like with what happened to Arabic, where the literary form is there and it's on the page, and there's a reluctance to leave it behind. And so people have a sense that what's on the page is real, but then the language keeps moving and changing and developing as all human speech inevitably does, such that after a while, here's an H and here's an L, and people hold on to them. And so what was it? A babysitter's aunt or something I met somewhere. My whole past is fading. But she, we're making small talk, and, she says she's Sinhalese. Sinhalese is a language related to Hindi, which is spoken, based for our purposes, it's one of the two languages spoken in Sri Lanka. There's Sinhalese and there's Tamil. And I said, oh yes, Sinhalese, the Sri Lankan language. And she said, but I don't really speak it. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, I grew up there, and I've been here 20 years, and I use it with my parents on the phone all the time, but I don't really speak it. And I was thinking, well, what do you mean you don't speak it? And she said, well, there's a real Sinhalese. Mine isn't real. And, this is somebody highly educated. I'm not making fun of her, but, linguistics is just one thing a person might know. And so I said, oh, wait a minute. Do you mean that you speak it fluently, and it was the first language that you learned, but there's something on the page that's different? And she said, yeah. And so, my father told me that what's on the page, that's Sinhalese. And what I speak is just some, she went like that. That's a perfectly natural impression. All it is it's a diglossia. Or if you go to Indonesia, that's another place where there is what you get taught in the books. The second you get off the plane, all anybody wants to talk about is, here's how we really speak Indonesian. And there are these endless conversations about how you don't need to say this, you don't need to put that in, we don't use this. It's another diglossia. So anybody in Indonesia who you have contact with, if you put the way people actually speak the language on the blackboard, they laugh. They don't think of it as something that's supposed to be official. That's something they think of as just spoken, as opposed to the standard, which is what they use whenever they're in school. It's whatever you see on a sign. It's what's written. Those are all cases of diglossia. All of these causes are things that it's as easy for them to happen as to not. So, diglossia. I want you to keep diglossia in your head, and now I'm going to do what seems like this. There are 4 parts to this talk. We're finished with 1. Now, this is part 2, and we're going to seem like we're just switching to something for no reason. But the reason that I'm going to talk a little bit about code switching is because it's going to bring us into something that's actually more pertinent to what I'm trying to get across. So, code switching. I think we all know what it is, and I wouldn't have said that, say, 35 years ago. But it's at the point where the conception of code switching has made it so much into the general consciousness that I suspect that I don't need to explain now that, for example, there are people who switch constantly between English and Spanish and English, and it doesn't mean that they don't speak either thing. I think that's known in a way that it wasn't in the past. I remember when I first moved to New York City, I was on some side of 20. In 1985, I had a very vanilla linguistic upbringing, and I heard people, New Yorkers, code switching on the train. I was self-conscious enough to have a journal back then, and I have looked back on my journals from the first weeks I spent in New York City, and I wrote in this aggrieved sympathy, I wrote, there are all these people who they switch between Spanish and English and Spanish, and you can tell they don't really speak either one. What kind of world does this to people? That's what I actually thought code switching was. I'll bet nobody is thinking that now, or if you are thinking it, you know now that that's not how code switching works. Rather, people speak both of the languages perfectly, and they switch back and forth. Now remember, code switching is not really what I'm talking about. I'm going to bring it in, but just by quick way of review. So you have this person who's talking about smoking, and you can see from what's in bold, that's the Spanish, and she keeps switching. And so I stopped smoking. So, dejé de fumar, and I'm back to it again. I didn't quit. I just stopped. I mean, it wasn't an effort that I made. Que voy a dejar de fumar porque me hace daño. I would run. And so she just switches back and forth. For those of you who are native speakers, I'm sorry about what I just did, but I was trying. And so, code switching works that way. And this is still not the topic, but just by way of review, it is worldwide. It is not just something that people do who speak English and Spanish. Gradually, you start to find in the world of how people use language. The question, again, is not, why do people code switch? How do they do that? The real question is, why do people not? If you really look at people around the world and how they actually use language. It really should be, there's some people who only just use the one language all the time. It's that way in some places, but that's about it. Some places, they're just big and prestigious. And so Hungarian and German, they're places where people toggle between the two. Sometimes it's in Hungary, there are places in Austria. And so what you can see here is that they switch into German, that's komm her, in bold, down on the second line. The rest of it is Hungarian. Often code switching is used to connote authority. That's one of many reasons you might use it. But here you have all the Hungarian. Well, come here, put all this away, both of you will now, and then come here, and then back to Hungarian. You don't get supper. You can see it with French and Wolof in Senegal. You can see code switching in Tanzania between English, Swahili, and then whatever local language is spoken in the place. All very common. So that's enough examples. And so, also, I want to show you something else because we tend sometimes not to be presented with code switching as what it is. Instead, people use cute terms to explain it. This is a movie. I have to make the screen go in a different way. Yi-Ting, I'm sorry. And it's not that I don't like technology, but I don't.
Okay, so
Okay. So what I have to press?
No.
Oh, is it?
Talks over.
See, this is what. So all I have to do is press escape. How counterintuitive. Okay.
Okay, so here you go.
Okay. This is a movie. And this is going to make it look like I'm so sophisticated that I'm always watching Bollywood movies, when really I don't. It was just an accident that I saw this one. But I recommend it. It was an immensely charming film. It was called Love Per Square Foot. The central couple were so thoroughly enchanting. And it's about real estate, but more to the point, they're speaking what's called Hinglish. And often Hinglish is thought of as a thing. But the truth is, if you're India And there is Hindi, not to mention other languages, and then a language with great prestige that tends to be used in not only formal but even semi-formal situations. And with America, unfortunately, having the great power that it does over the media and popular culture and the internet and aviation language, well, of course, people are going to do a lot of code switching between English and Hindi to the point that you almost hear this one mixed language. So this is the trailer, and this just gives you a sample of how language is used.
I'll find a place on rent. I can afford no now. The wedding will happen when it has to happen.
Yeah, but when?
हाउसिंग स्कीम इसी के लिए लोन अप्लाई किया था।
तुम ये सब अकेले क्यों कर रहे हो? जॉइंट लोन के लिए क्यों नहीं अप्लाई करते विद योर Are you married?
जहाँ से दिखे सारा जहाँ हम दोनों जॉइंट लोन नहीं ले सकते।
ये मैरिड कपल है।
Yeah, I know. मैं बस बोल रहा हूँ कि फॉर्म भर देते हैं और फिर बाद में सबमिट करते हैं। अगर लॉटरी लग गई तो लाइफ बन जाएगी यार।
पे छींटे पड़े जब ले समंदर करवटें जहाँ सब हो अपना ना किराए पे मिले।
शहर में स्पेस भी तो नहीं है ना? और you know, पपी।
वैसे ना मुझे तेरे 50-50 समझ में आ गया। रोमांस का 50 संजय के साथ और शादी का 50 सैम के साथ।
I cheated and
नहीं, करीना, you didn't cheat. वो
Like that. So they switch, aren't they just? They switch and they switch throughout. I remember watching the film. I had been assigned to watch it for a reason that we won't go into. And I remember thinking, I actually almost don't need the subtitles, but I do, because they're constantly switching between a language I know nothing of and English, but enough so that I could have followed it without knowing Hindi and without having the subtitles. And that's an example of how code switching goes. It's just all over the place. Now, so that's code switching. It's not just New Eurekan, it's worldwide. What's kind of odd is if nothing like that is going on. And now, eating, we're going to wait for the disaster because I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, I think so. Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make it easy. Okay, so I'm going to make it bigger. Now, this is what's important about the code switching. Code switching is an extreme example where you're going between two completely different languages, where really something else that people do is called style switching. It's not as graphic, it's subtler, but it's based on very similar principles in terms of why you do it as both diglossia and sometimes code switching, especially diglossia. And that is that you switch between different ways of using your own language. Not necessarily completely different dialects, it's subtler than that, but all day long, all through your life, you're making these kinds of switches based on who you're talking to and what you're saying. It comes in very subtle places. So this is a cartoon from the 1950s. It's made by the people who created, for those of you who go back a bit, Mr. Magoo and Gerald McBoing-Boing. And I highly recommend it just because it's very cute, but it also has some perfect examples of code switching from vanilla American English. And so Christopher Crumpet is a little boy who changes into a chicken when he gets angry. You have to see it, but let's make sure it works. Okay, cute theme music. See, those are flutes. Now, I'm going to find the part where, okay, let's listen to them have a conversation. Okay.
I don't care. I still want one.
I can't afford one, even if I could find one.
I want one.
You can't have one, and that's that. Look, Ethel, this is impossible. I can't get him a rocket ship.
Well, you know Christopher. Either you get him what he wants, or you got a chicken for a son.
Okay. Now listen to that again. You know Christopher, but listen to her closely.
You get him what he wants, or you got a chicken for a son.
One more time.
Look, Ethel, this is impossible. I can't get him a rocket ship.
Well, you know Christopher. Either you get him what he wants, or you got a chicken for a son.
Okay, so despite what the subtitles do, what she says is, well, you know Christopher, and so you either give him what he wants or you got a chicken for a son. So, you know Christopher, you either give him what he wants or you got a chicken for a son. Now, that is perfect 1950s English, but why did she say all of a sudden you got? Because if you took that cartoon character aside and you said, let's call her Marion. So, Marion, why did you say you got a chicken for a son? That's not proper English. Didn't you want to say you've got a chicken for a son? Almost certainly she would say, well, I think I did say you've got a chicken for a son. I would never say you got a chicken. I wouldn't say that at all. But she did say it, and that's because she was style shifting. The reason that this quote-unquote proper person who grew up with Dick and Jane says, you got a chicken for a son, is because it's this difficult little issue, it's getting down to cases, you can't do anything about it, it's about your son, it's about this chicken. You got a chicken for a son. You got to watch out for yourself. You got to take it easy. That's when we do style shifts like that. And something that many of you might be thinking of now, and you are correct, is that this happens also with Standard English and Black English. Nowadays it's often called African American Vernacular English. I'm going to call it Black English. And it's not only a matter of switching between the Standard English and the dialect. That's been often talked about, and many Black people feel when that comes up, I don't talk like that. What is this full-blown ghetto dialect from the 60s or 70s that supposedly Black people switch into all the time? I've never said anything like that. And often they're correct. As often as not, especially among more educated Black people, it's a matter of something more subtle, which is style shifting. And I want to give you a cool example of this. There is National Public Radio, and there's a different flavor of it in each city. I imagine here there's a flavor of it. Well, here it would be the WAMC, the Washington, WAMU, yeah, the Washington one. Well, in New York, it's WNYC. And there's an afternoon show about the arts, and it's hosted by a woman named Allison Stewart. And Allison Stewart is a Black woman with a typical educated Black woman's range from Standard to Black English of a sort. And so you have to listen to her very closely to get the sort of thing that I mean. And so this is just how she sounds during most of any show.
This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart, live from the WNYC studios in Soho. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. I'm really grateful you're here. On today's show, I'll speak with Russ Bengtson, the author of this great book called The History of Basketball.
So that's how she usually sounds. Now, here, she's talking to Black artists, and they're having a really good conversation about the making of this movie, which I have to remember to see, actually. And I want you to listen to certain things that happen when she's speaking to these particular guests.
Is this separation of, continental Africans and diaspora Africans, specifically in the United States?
This is not Allison Stewart. This
All
is
right, Blitz,
the
this is a personal question. I'm going to Ghana in about 3 or 4 months.
Okay.
What's one thing I should do?
Nice.
Oh, man. What's one thing? Oh, gosh, there's so many things.
I have a week, but we only have 35 minutes for this interview, so I don't want to take it up with my travel itinerary.
So, not
sure.
I said pause. So, not 35 minutes, but 35 minutes, just right there. I'm going to play her again, and there are about 5 things she does. Now, it's the last thing she would be thinking about, but this is how human beings talk.
American literature that made an intentional connection. So it really struck me. And I think a lot of that was part of what attracted me to this opportunity, was to really get to explore this yearning that is this separation of, continental Africans and diaspora Africans, specifically in the United States.
Okay, here it comes.
All right, Blitz, this is a personal question. I'm going to Ghana in about 3 or 4 months. What's one thing I should do?
Nice.
Oh, man. What's one thing? Oh, gosh, there's so many things.
I have a week, but we only have 35 minutes for this interview, so I don't want to take it up with my travel itinerary.
So you can see that suddenly she has a different sound. If you want to go too far into it, not but. Very subtle vowel placement. But that there's a black English coloring there that she went into, I'm sure not thinking about it because it was a very deep and jolly conversation with black guests, and she was really interested in what they were actually saying, interesting things. So when Ghana comes up, Alison Stewart subconsciously starts sounding blacker, despite the fact that the other way that she talks, frankly, you wouldn't know what race she was. I remember, honestly, I didn't know for about a year when she started being on. And when I found out she was, I remember telling my girls who were 10 and 13, I'm doing it. Whenever I talk about their ages, I pantomime it with my hands. I don't know how that helps anything, but they are 10 and 13, and we were in the car, and I said, do you know that Alison Stewart is a black woman? And neither one of them could believe it. They just said, her. But if you listen closely, you can actually hear it. So what she's doing is style. What she's doing is high style. What she's doing is style switching. What do I do to make it big? Just what button do I push? Share. Thank you, E.T. If I did that, somebody's toilet would flush in Detroit. But if you do it, it works. So why do people do this? And style switching is not conscious, usually, but it's like with the glossia, it's formality. And so there was one way that you talk when things are formal. When things get informal, you might change. You're accommodating to other speakers. Alison Stewart, I think, was doing some of that, because in interviews where no one is black, she sounds the same way through the whole interview. But when she has black guests on, often there are those subtle little things where suddenly you can hear that there is an aspect of that in her way of speaking. Modern people looking at this often are saying today that it's about speaker design. So you're crafting the identity that you want to project. But it's the same sort of thing as the diglossia. It's where an American person, whether they are white like Mrs. Crumpet or black like Alison Stewart, can do something that the Swiss and Arabic speakers are doing just within a narrower dimension. Now, an interesting thing that you can see is that in some parts of the world, style switching can be of amazingly fine gradations. And so, I apologize to the signers for the way this slide works, but there are all of these ways of saying I gave him in Guyanese Creole. Guyanese Creole, which often they refuse to use in schools, think it's sort of a language of the gutter. No, I don't think so. Because if you get a bunch of speakers with very different life experiences and say, how do you say I gave him? You can get all of these versions going from the standard version down on the bottom, I gave him, except with Guyanese accent, to me bin gi I basically me ben give him in what would be the Creole that's most unlike the standard English. And so if you can go from the top, and I'm purposely putting the quote-unquote L dialect on the top, then you can go bit by bit, and it gets closer and closer. You get away from ben, and then it becomes did, and then after a while, you get the vowel change from give to gave, and then you have the standard. And you have all of these ways of saying it in that one rather small society, and people don't walk around thinking, now I'm speaking the acrolect, that's I gave him, now I'm speaking the basilect, that's the mibingiam, now I'm going to do some meselect. Most people aren't thinking about that at all. It's just that their style switching happens according to a much wider range than Alison Stewart or Mrs. Crumpet. In other words, it's a richer linguistic context than the one that most of us are used to. I will never forget, it was, 1992. It's January 1992. This struck me so much. I was at a conference, my dissertation advisor was Guyanese, and another Guyanese linguist walked into the elevator with us, and it was a tall building, so we were going all the way up. We both were on like the 30th floor. And they hadn't seen each other in a while, and so they started accommodating to each other and speaking more and more in Guyanese Creole, which I don't speak. And so it started with standard English, except them having it with an accent different from mine on floor 1. And as we went up, I understood less and less and less of anything they were saying. And then we all got out of the elevator. They might as well have been speaking Hungarian and went off together. And I went off with my standard English and sobbed into a pillow. I wasn't crying, but it was interesting to see the continuum happening in the elevator, because that's exactly how this is represented. Anybody who grew up in Jamaica knows this. They might not tell you, but they do. Anybody from Belize, anybody from quote unquote the islands, this is a Creole continuum, and it's there in societies where it's often said that the way that people speak is quaint. So, I'm going to give you one more thing. This is the fourth part. So there's the code switching, but don't think about that. Think about the style switching. Then there's also register. And so if you can almost feel jealous, like if you're speaking this generic, vanilla, American, Walter Cronkite kind of English, but that's too dated. Generic, American, Tucker Carlson kind of, no, generic, vanilla, American, Chris Hayes kind of English. If you feel like that's no fun, because frankly it isn't, then you look at the diglossia. We have some, and so for example, children, kids. Think about that. Children, that's high. Kids, that's low. Bags, where are my bags? That's low. Where are my parcels? I don't really know what a parcel is, but it's high, and so there's that. Or something like, what's another, there's a great example. Oh, the one that I don't like, but it's established because language always changes. There are vegetables, then there are veggies, that's the low. And people are beginning to just use it informally. Do you want your veggies? And I often think, no, not if you say it like that. Do you want your vegetables? I don't want any damn veggies, but it has become a normal word. Here's how to save your veggies. Make sure that Jared eats his veggies. That's high and low. And what a lot of this has to do with is something that linguists call register, and that is that we use different vocabulary in particular, depending on especially occupational settings or avocational settings. And this is partly about the same formality and informality as diglossia is, and so we can think of ourselves as having some. Then it's also about the technical versus the non-technical. You can do a 4-part hierarchy. And so, informally, to go from the bottom, non-technical, we got some salt. That's real English. Then you could go informal but kind of technical, like you're doing a science experiment. We got some sodium chloride. You might say that. That's like the boy who has a science kit next door or something. Then it could be formal, but non-technical. And so it's, say, Dilbert at a presentation. And so we obtain some salt, sir. It's Smithers. And so a corporate presentation. Then there's formal and technical. And so we obtain some sodium chloride. And so that's the most registery that we have. But then again, here it's less about thinking of us than pulling the camera out, because register goes wild in some languages. It tends, in my experience, to be the very smaller and more isolated languages. It tends, in my experience, to especially, for some reason, I never thought about this until now, it's going to be in India and Southeast Asia and thereabouts that you get some really funky register. And so this is a language called Kman, or sometimes Kaman, or sometimes Miju. I'll stop. And in India, and they have a hunting register. And so if you're out hunting, then you use different words, or if you're talking about hunting, you use different words for animals. To be honest, if you look down below, it gets into ginger and rice. I don't know what they have to do with hunting, but I have not been. But you can imagine with the other things. And so a takin, I'm just guessing it's something like a warthog. There are 2 ways to say that. If you're dealing with a bear, then it's either a kum, but if you're out hunting, then it's a hum wartong. And that's just something you know. There are 4,000 Kmans. It's a tiny community that reproduces itself, isolated in India. My bet is that it has no linguistic relatives. And some people think otherwise, but it's an isolate, as we call it. And so you have a hunting register. Now you're thinking, yeah, But there's 6 registers. If you're a shaman, you use different words when you're shamaning than when you're not. And so for the word bad, roughly, if you're speaking as a shaman about that which is bad, then it's apu miru, and so on and so on. There is a shaman register, and they don't only use it with each other. You know that there are words that the shaman, there are only so many, but there are words that they're going to use in front of you while they're trying to heal someone or something, and you just have to know what they are. For poetry, we have poetic words, ere I'm gone, or the morn, or something like that, but we don't really like it, whereas in Khan, there is a whole poetic register. If you're an alcoholic and you want to express that poetically, I don't know, there's a different word. If you have a child, there's one word that's normal, and then there's another one to say that which came from my loins, I suppose, or something like that. That was terrible. I'm so sorry. But the poetic word for child, whatever that is, my offspring or something. And, for means of transport. And of course, these are only partial lists. These are things that, to be a Khman speaker, is to know all of this, and there's other stuff. We have baby talk as in roughly body parts. And so you've got your tootsies for your feet, and you've got your mitts for your, well, that's not baby talk, but your mitts for your hands, and then you've got your tum-tum, and you've got your peepers. These are not baby terms, come to think of it. There are only so many baby talk words, whereas in Khman, you've got another list like these. It's about 50 words that you use when talking about babies. I don't have that list because it wouldn't fit on the screen. But here is the takeaway from all of this. So that's just to show that we're talking about sodium chloride. They're languages which, to exaggerate, all register is all. So to speak largely in only one way, it can feel normal, but it's by no means a universal human experience. It's a norm that humans have different ways of speaking their language according to context. Roughly speaking, context, but as you see, it's richer than that. Often, humans think of the colloquial variety as less real than the formal one, but there's no scientific basis for that classification. And if it seems that there's a way of speaking that we slip into at times, and that maybe we shouldn't, or that we speak a language fluently, but it isn't the real language, or that somebody is being fake when they speak in a different way in a setting than they usually do, as in, back in the day, people hearing Barack Obama speaking somewhat blackly, like Allison Stewart, and thinking he was a phony. This was very common from about 2008 until people kind of got the news in about 2012. If he can speak standard English, then why is he speaking blackly to that black audience? It was perfectly natural, but it really did throw a lot of people, including some black people, believe it or not. But that was a mistake. They didn't understand that people normally speak in 2 ways. So, if you're thinking about things like that, it's based on a natural but mistaken idea that the somewhat vanilla linguistic landscape of the United States of America is a default, while what happens with language in other places is exotic. And in the grand scheme of things, to speak only standard American English is rather, to use today's idiom, basic, as in, ya basic. It's basic to only speak standard American English. And so, I hereby thank you for being with me, and I'm always open to questions. You don't have to memorize that. It's online. Just I teach at Columbia. Look up my name, and if you have a question and you feel like writing it, write me there. I'm elderly, therefore I like email. I'm very comfortable with it. Not Instagram, but email. Remember the long email days? And so I will answer. I like it there. Thank you very much. What happens now? Oh, okay.
Moderated Q&A. Thank you so much, John. We now have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. Naya and Rochelle are here on each side with the microphones, so you can go ahead and raise your hand, and they will walk the mic to you, and I will call on you.
Rochelle is in transit, but she will be there shortly.
Got it. I see a question out in front here. Yes.
Hi. First, I'm a big fan. Love seeing you have conversations with Glenn on the Glenn Show. But
Thank you for watching.
Oh yeah. So I'm familiar with Italian, and I know that, for instance, like the Neapolitan dialect is really distinctive from, I think, what you call standard Italian, which is probably more like Florence area. Do you have any like knowledge on how something becomes like the official dialect and other things are just considered, local? Like how does one take over?
Yeah, it's a different story in each place, but roughly the prestigious location, often it's the government and a combination of that and centers of education. A sense settles in, usually sometime in the Middle Ages, that the way locals speak there is the real thing. And that's definitely what happened in Italy. There was a certain cherishing of the Tuscan region and the accomplishments that came from there, which were seen as higher. And as a result, Italy is a fascinating situation because what you learn is that Italy, and you don't hear it as much about Germany, where it's the same thing there, but Italy has a lot of dialects. And so there's the one that you learn in school, but watch out when you go to Naples, because if you listen to the guy who's at the butcher, he's speaking something that's going to be hard to understand. Whereas the truth is, the whole concept of what Italian is a completely artificial mess created by the notion of Italy as a unified country. So Garibaldi creates this Italy. But if you go into the south of Italy, or especially to Sicily, Sicilian is not the same language as the Italian that we learn in school at all. And so it's good that actually in the movies, when they're Sicilians, they actually bother to have them speaking something other than, buongiorno, because that's just not the language. If you roll the dice again, Sicilian would be seen as different from Italian as Portuguese is from Spanish, if not more. And then as you go north, there are these varieties that you're told, this is the Piedmontese variety of Italian. Piedmontese is as if Italian and French had a love child, and the love child took more after French. But because it's in Italy, they say, well, this is Italian. And so really, there are many languages spoken in Italy, and it's just because people decided, hooray for Dante, and so that's the real language. It's not fair, but there are things that we can't change.
Question over here?
This gentleman flagged me down.
Appreciate your talk, Professor McWhorter.
Thank you,
what do
Malik.
you think about, what do you think is the role of any, of humor in both appreciating these distinctions and differences and also, I don't want to say ironing over, but giving us the permission to laugh? I was thinking about the famous scene in Airplane, the two African Americans sitting there, speaking very exaggerated 70s, and then the stewardess comes over and says, oh, I speak jive, and they kind of go back and forth. I wish we could see it. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. So,
it's 1979 now.
Yeah. So, what role does humor play? I guess that's the first part of the question. And secondly, are there things you think that, sort of normal people can do to sort of, ease the tension on some of these, debates and the feeling that, it all matters so much?
Malik, you're getting at the fact that juxtaposing high and low and putting the L in the H and the H in the L is part of what's funny. One of the things that makes me laugh the most is mixing the high and the low because they're not in the context they're supposed to be. That's a lot of humor. Are You Being Served? Talk about 1979. It's this British sitcom about people working in a department store. That doesn't sound good, but a lot of it is about language. And there's one character, she's from the North, and she's kind of what we might call lower middle class, maybe working class person. And she's often a little bit kind of snooty. And she'll say things where she ends up mixing the low and the high. So she'll say, what really gets up my nose is these high taxes. And to me, that's funny. There's a joke she makes that I can't use here because I'm being recorded, but it involves, it involves a cat, and she uses a word for a cat. But anyway, the point is, what worries me is that sometimes we get so sensitive these days that we can't laugh at those things. And so, for example, what's funny about the airplane joke is those guys are in suits. You know, they're sitting there and they're speaking this quote-unquote jive that nobody can even understand. I remember first seeing that with my father, and my father said, play that again. And he said, I understand some of those expressions, but it's that deep. And I don't know if people know that the woman who comes over and says, oh, I can translate, I can speak jive, that was Mrs. Cleaver. That was Barbara Billingsley. And so that's even more of the joke. And apparently she had to be dubbed. So it's not her, but still, it's like the whitest person in the world. That's funny too. I hope we can keep laughing at that, because a lot of wit is that mixing the L and the H, and we should be able to laugh at it instead of worrying too much about hurt feelings, except where there's a real reason to.
Over there? Yep.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for your contribution to American society at large. And also, do you think formality is something that came in with like written language? Are there any examples of any languages without formality? Is there an essential human condition?
Oh, that's a good one. No, it's easy to think that formality comes with books. No. Any real language has its high and its low, as we see in Khman, which nobody will ever write down, and yet it's got a very rich kind of highness in it. Or any Native American language, very few of them were written in any real way. And if you scratch the surface, of course, if you ask the person, is there a formal way? That's not how to do it. But as you learn how the language is used, there's what's only used in ceremonies versus what's used in real life. Often the high language is more poetic, and so there's one. All right, I'm almost sure it's Zuni. I'm a little underslept. I'm pretty sure it's Zuni. And the word for frog is frog. And then the word that you use poetically is something along the lines of jumping creature that can't completely fit into the bottom of the jar, or something like that. That is their high. I also recommend, folks, something that people don't do enough. Go online and look at what the skeleton of a frog looks like. It's just a wonder. Anyway, that is the answer. That is the answer to that question.
Any other questions? In yellow?
In the yellow, I'm going to pass this down.
Thank you very much. I'm really appreciating this talk and this discussion.
Good.
I'm a music professor here, and I'm a white woman.
You are? I'm sorry.
For sure. It's germane to my question.
Okay.
That is that I'm trying to do some anti-racist pedagogy in my class, and along with the Western European music that we teach, I'm trying to bring in some what I consider American/African American music. And so I'm up there talking about Negro spirituals. What is appropriate for me to say when I speak this language? Right, that the various transcriptions put in what I guess I would call low language, which was maybe more accurate to the way the music sounded when it was sung by these people. I can't do anything but replicate it with much good sense of integrity. And so I'm kind of asking you, when we get into these situations where we're trying to be an ally or express compassion or something like that, what's a good way to handle that?
Do you mean just uttering certain words?
I do, or singing them.
All right, two answers. I think that this new thing, that you're not allowed to say Negro, is an absurdity. Wow. And it makes me angry, because I've been around long enough to know that there was a time when no one would have thought anything of it. It's an antique word now, but the fact that it sounds vaguely like a certain other one means that you can't talk about Harry Burley's Negro spirituals. I think it is an abomination. I don't like it. However, that is considered one of my contrarian views, and there are a great many people who feel differently, and I'm not saying that, well, I have said it. I've said it's an abomination. I have to. However, we all have lives to lead. We're not going to die on every hill, and so maybe you could bleep yourself out or just kind of talk around the word, etc. But the one where I would hope that maybe, and I know you're a white woman, and that puts you in a position, especially these days, how much flack do you want to get? It frankly only takes one student, and next thing you know, you're being disciplined, etc. But for example, if you're inserting black music into that course, I would hope that you would use William Levi Dawson's Negro Symphony, because it's really as good as anything that was being written at the time. And one of the saddest things that I heard in 2021 and 2022 is that people wanted to do their jobs by playing somebody black other than Florence Price, and frankly, the Negro Symphony is the best of everything written then. I'm not putting down Florence Price, but it's better than any of her 4 symphonies. But they weren't programming it because they didn't want to use that name.
Yeah, I know, this is a difficulty, and I actually hired a black music scholar to help me negotiate that boundary, and she told me, be sure you say Negro. Now, I coughed over it for a while, right? But I'm doing it now, yeah.
You've done it twice, and you know, the sky has not fallen.
And some of it is much more extreme than Negro. Right.
Yeah, and I mean, there are other words where I would say, no, you're just not going to say it. But when it comes to the word Negro, that's the word that was still being used when I was in diapers. I mean, that's what the word was, and it wasn't an insult then. It's just archaic. How dare you call me something that's out of date? That's new. No. So I would say be brave within limits.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. So I have a question about the diglossia. What makes a language have more or less of it? My first language is Russian, and I don't think Russian has much of it at all.
No, you don't. And that's because Russian is a big, giant, highly standardized language. And there are a great many people of a great many ethnicities who speak Russian. And so if you're talking about Moscow or St. Petersburg, or, for example, Sao Paulo, or if you're talking about Beijing, no, there is not diglossia in places like that, just like here in vanilla America. But even in your country, it depends on where you go. If you go up into northern Russia, there are some interesting Russian dialects where if a person's in the classroom, they're going to speak what you speak, but then mommy's knee is going to be all sorts of things going on with the vowels and stuff going on with the suffixes and the prefixes that are very interesting, or have to be very careful on this. If you, very careful, remove the geographical lines from what's going on now, blow some fairy dust over the whole thing, and then start over. And everybody's speaking the same stuff, but there's no such thing as Belarus, no Ukraine, no Russia. It's just everybody going, Zdravstvuyte. Okay. If that were the case, as you went south in this place full of Slavs, and maybe a little west, there'd be a lot of people who were speaking two things. The two things might be what we know of as Russian and Ukrainian. I'm not putting those two things on levels, but all of those things are, as I'm sure you know, very closely related. Not to mention that Russia doesn't study its non-standard varieties that much, or they don't usually have it outside of Russian, and so only Russians can read it. But especially as you go east, there are some diglossias out there between the way Russian is spoken in, for example, the one I know because of somebody I knew was Turkmenistan, the way they speak Russian versus the way that person would speak Russian to me or something. So it's there, but you don't hear as much about it, and definitely not in big European, big city Russia. Yeah, that's why you're not recognizing it.
How about up front here?
Hello, my name's Crystal. So I've always grew up with learning foreign languages, and I continue to learn and study more. Currently, I volunteer as a speaking partner to international students that want to practice English. And one of the interesting conversations I had with my partner that's from Vietnam was telling me about how there are people that aren't as, I would say, comfortable, or that are able to understand her or tend to misunderstand her, and she really wants to practice her English more. So that got me thinking and got me more curious about wanting to learn more about like the judgment of having an accent, specifically people with thick accents. So I wonder if you would have any opinions on that.
You mean on people's judgments as to thick accents and their attitudes towards them?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's hard because it's one thing to have a judgment about an accent where there's no issue of comprehension, where if you just don't like someone's accent, you probably need to get over it or just avoid them. That's one thing. But if we're talking about issues of comprehension, that's hard because, of course, that person is trying their best. And you could say that even the way that they're speaking, let's say it's an accent in English, the way they're speaking English is their English. And I would say that intimates might learn to understand by listening more closely, but there are issues if the person's in an official capacity. A good friend of mine is somebody who works on accent reduction for teachers, the idea being that you need to be able to understand. Some people, though, are better at reproducing an accent around them than others, and it just depends on where things are. Advice that I've heard foreigners into America give one another, and it certainly has worked for me in my approximations of other languages, is people should be told, imitate them. Like, listen to them, listen to their melody. Oh, no, that's not the advice. The advice is, talk as if you were making fun of them, and you will get closer to the way they actually talk. And then I have thought, yeah, okay, let's do an Italian accent. And it does make the Italian better. And so there's that. And this is not to ridicule, but that's something I think people don't always know to do. And so that person, however they think English sounds, like Germans apparently think English sounds like white banana, white banana, white banana. That's how it sounds. However it sounds in Vietnamese, have her try to sound like that. And maybe that'll help a little bit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious about the implication of this in terms of like Black diaspora linguistic connection. So is style the midpoint in terms of how we're able to understand each other? Because I'm thinking about when you did the trailer for the Hindu English and you said how we needed the transcriptions, but we also didn't. And I'm also thinking about like the creolization, like in patois, like I can understand, I can get hints. So I really think your research is interesting in terms of reimagining fluency as like a technical and cultural framework, like beyond just the grammar. So like, yeah, so style is it the midpoint of understanding in terms of Black linguistic, diasporic linguistic frameworks, yeah.
Yeah. I think that we need to open up our view of what it is to express yourself as a normal human being. And so with English, I don't think it's going to change. That's the way it is. And we should be able to hear people who are doing that kind of thing with languages and just think of it as normal. Jamaica is a great example. It's like, for me, it's like listening to a radio station that kind of, it goes out and it comes in and it goes out. And if I were there longer, I would understand all of it. But that is the way Jamaicans speak. And to find anyone who's speaking full patois, incomprehensible to me all the time, that's usually children or people who are very poor. And I'm not usually going to meet them if I'm there in Kingston running around. Most people just speak, it's a mix. And that is the way English is there. And I think that some people think, well, they'll learn. No, they don't need to learn, because frankly, patois is every bit as interesting scientifically in terms of how it works as English. For example, are you by any chance from Jamaica?
No, not.
Are you by any chance from people who are from Jamaica?
No.
Okay, then you can't ask your mother what I was going to give you, but there are fascinating things in patois that any Martian would say, this is a complicated language, and it's just that people don't talk about it enough.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, thank you for the presentation and lecture. Really appreciate the representation of Indian community and the Indian American diaspora. So I have two questions for you. One is, why, because you talked about textbook English, a textbook language, and then the colloquial language that people speak. So why do we even have that distinction? Why do we have in school textbook language that's being taught to students? My second question is, when do words or something starts becoming a language or stops becoming a language?
The second question is, where do you draw the line? And how you determine that it's become a different language is partly a matter of power. It's partly a matter of comprehension. You really can't know. And so, for example, random. Sweden. If you're in Sweden and you go really up far north, really off into the woods, they speak something that is completely different in terms of the sounds. Swedish has 2 genders. This has like practically 4. It's just a completely different thing. It's called Ostrobothnian Swedish, but it's not Swedish. If you roll the dice again, it would be called Elfdalian, which is the other name for it. And, you know, frankly, it's going to be dead about next week, and so nobody's ever going to make the decision. But around the world, there are cases like that. In India, for example, Hindi. What's Hindi? Hindi is a lot of things, if you think about the stretch of Hindi spoken. Hindi, especially as you move east, it's so many different things that, for example, in some sources, I'm told that Bahá'í is a language. In other sources, I'm told Bahá'í is just Hindi. Most Hindi speakers have told me, oh, that's just a kind of Hindi. I'm not sure how you would decide what the answer was. In terms of why we have the standard as opposed to the colloquial, why do we elevate the standard in that way? If you think about it, humans are conservative in certain ways, and once the language is on the page, once it's in cold print, it doesn't move. It just stays there. And so, doesn't that look kind of real? Because it's not moving, and it's nice and straight, and nobody's saying like, and it's just right there. That looks real. And so once it's on the page, there's this sense that it's not that the language keeps on doing what it does and nobody remembers how your great-grandfather talked anyway. It's that there's this thing that sits on the page, and it's from 19 generations back, but it's on that page. Books smell good. Somebody wrote it, and so you think this is the real thing, and I don't speak the real thing. I find that completely natural, but it is a shame. When your brain is on writing, you devalue the vitality of language as it actually is, and that's just worldwide.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. This bottle is going to explode. It's going to go psh.
Apologies.
Oh.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm here with the Montgomery Blair Linguistics Club, and okay, so a question that I had. Well, I just want to preface by saying you are really funny, and you really remind me of a teacher that I have at Blair. His name is Dr. Howard. Hilarious.
I would love to know who that was.
It's crazy, right? Like, okay, so I just wanted to know your opinion on white people or just people in general talking because Black people picking up African American English or culture, because it may be trendy, or in the case of the Kardashians, because they want to get more money, whatever way you want to think of it, and how they may use it for publicity or even to seem cool when they speak. I wanted to know your opinion on that, because me personally, I don't.
One, it's inevitable. If we're going to share this country, and we're going to share these spaces, and we're going to share music the way it's been, especially since the 90s, there's no way that white people are not going to start talking more like Black people. And I know this sounds, my voice just did the crack. I'm going to make it not do that again. Okay, and if people are going to be together. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, but the fact that so many white people are beginning to talk that way, taking the slang and little intonations, is an indication that things are changing for the better. And I know it can often not look that way, especially over the past 3 weeks and 2 days, but it is a different time than, and I have to do this thing, than when I was in college, when white kids were not blacking that way. And it was a more starkly racist world. I missed the real thing. But still, in the 80s, I understand, though, how fake it can seem, or like an example where what I just said is what I believe, but I'm also a person, and I find it unwatchable, is a particular comedian. His name is Matt Rife. And he's he's 35, he's very good looking, and he's always dipping into this black English to sound authentic and fun. It's very hard to watch because it looks fake. I get the feeling he knows that he's doing it. He's not black at all. But the thing is, he's young. He's never known another world, and he probably grew up listening to a lot of hip hop. So it's real, it's not gonna stop. If you don't like it, you're gonna perceive it getting worse, and I don't think that it's gonna change, but it's a sign of something good. I don't feel, maybe you feel, but I don't feel that it's ridicule, and I don't feel that it's exploiting us to try to be funny. So a white kid says, well, that's ratchet. I don't feel like anybody took anything from, well, as if I walk around saying it, but I don't feel like that person took anything from maybe you've still got it too. I don't know if you feel that way.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, personally, like, if I see, like, I don't know, if I see, like, a white kid being like, oh, that's ghetto, I'm like, well, what do you know about ghetto? Like, so what's ghetto to you? Like,
well, that's different. I mean, that particular expression is tacky. I mean, because what do you mean by that? Whatever you're referring to as ghetto, why do you think it was that way? There's an insensitivity there. I thought you meant things like somebody saying yo or something like that.
Can I get some hands from people in the middle who have had their hand up for a while? You can pass that one over if next to you.
All right. Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm also here from the Montgomery Blair Linguistics Club. And so
Say that last part again.
I'm also here from the Montgomery Blair Linguistics.
Okay.
Yeah. And so my question for you was, you talked a little bit about Caribbean Creoles, and I know something that's going on right now is a lot of them are going through like a sort of post-creolization process where they're kind of shifting closer to the standard English. And I know like similar things are happening, like in North India, for example, like a lot of like regional Indo-Aryan languages are kind of shifting towards Hindi. Is that sort of a thing that's a trend that's happening around the world where these, I guess, local dialects or basilex, like you mentioned, are sort of shifting towards the acrolex and the diglossias kind of disappearing?
Yeah. That is a very strong trend. Linguistic diversity is ever lesser. I hate to be the bearer of bad news today, but that's not going to change, unfortunately. It's what happens with globalization. And it's not only dialects and Creole-lex, but it's also just small languages. Small languages are dying out. The rate at which they're dying out has been exaggerated somewhat. It depends on where you are. But for example, there are languages in South America that, because the Amazon is being raised down, there are languages there, some of the most fascinating languages in the world, that are just disappearing before anybody can do anything more than gather a word list. Now the truth is, a little bit of good news, languages in Africa are not disappearing that much. There are various reasons, but Africa is home to two languages. 2,000 languages, and not many of them are dying, and so that's okay. But with South America, or an awful lot of languages in Southeast Asia, and frankly, everything here and everything in Australia, a lot is just gone. And that includes the most interesting non-standard dialects, such as Cornwall English. When everybody comes together, especially into cities, those non-standard ways of speaking tend to be under threat. It's unfortunate, but yeah. Now, everybody in the world is not going to speak English. There's no danger of anything like that. But a lot of the fun stuff on the sides, yeah, it's going.
there.
Which one? Color of the shirt?
On the aisle. Cream-colored glasses.
So we're going to do this one, and then we're going to do this one.
Cream-colored glasses girl.
Because
Thank you. Cream-colored glasses girl here speaking. I was curious if the formal high variety of the glossia, does that evolve slower than the informal colloquial? And I'm also just curious now, since you mentioned this clip of this comedian, does social media and the internet slow down or speed up language evolution in general?
The high tends to change more slowly because it's on paper and we like to keep it the way it is, whereas the L just jumps along. And yeah, social media, especially with slang, stuff comes and goes much more quickly than it used to. I don't think that it makes the language itself overall change faster, but stuff comes and goes. And so, for example, remember hashtag? You might not. That was like the big fat joke 10 years ago. Haven't heard it in a while. That would have lasted longer if hashtag had been in 1945. And so you never know. But it's always something. We forget how quickly slang disappears in general. The cartoon character Bugs Bunny, for example, his catchphrase is, "What's up, Doc?" What's up, Doc came from what high school kids in southern Texas were saying in jest in 1930 to each other. It came, it went. We would have no idea about it if the person who created Bugs Bunny hadn't happened to have Bugs Bunny say, "What's up, Doc?" So even then, but something has definitely happened in the more general sense these days.
I'm going to pass this to the woman in the tan.
Hi. So I was curious, discussing the evolution of language and the difference between the high and low varieties of different languages. You also mentioned very briefly about how since higher levels of language are on the page, do you see, at least in American political society today, that continuing to be the higher level of language in the political landscape? As from what I have seen, there seems to be a shift down into lower language than there used to be when that was more the esteemed level of language that people would stick to.
You are correct. And so what I did not bother to mention was that diglossias tend to be falling somewhat apart in many countries, with the L taking up ever more space. And so it's not that the H disappears, but the L is used more. And here, that's definitely true. And so if it were, say, 1865, I could almost get away with saying that there's an H here and an L here, the language of the Gettysburg Address versus what we can barely get at, which is the way ordinary people standing there were talking to each other. But that has been changing here, especially since the 60s, and the L language is used more. So, for example, the version of me in 1910, other than that I would be white, would be that if I were giving this talk to this audience, I would be reading from paper. I would have walked out, for one thing, in a suit. I would have walked out in a suit, and I would have went, and then I would have read from something, and that would have been the way it was done. Notice, I walk out here in practically my street clothes, and I just talk. That's not the way it used to be. I'm speaking a kind of a high L, and that's what I speak. That started in the 60s. There's a book about it. It's called Doing Our Own Thing, and it's this charming anthropological portrait of how we basically lost our H in this country. It was written in 2003, and it had a paperback in 2004, and I don't remember who wrote it. I wrote it. So, doing our own thing.
Over there.
Thank you very much for this. With the we're sort of in this weird period where we're having a lot more generated text through large language models. Do you think those are going to accelerate or accelerate the collapse of sort of high language?
I've been telling people I'm on sabbatical, and I thought I was going to dedicate it to learning more about AI, because people keep asking about it, and I'm supposed to know, and instead I've been teaching myself to play the clarinet and reading comic strips and learning how to cook. And I knew how to cook, but I've been actually learning I can steam dumplings now. I made a cake. I mean, it's amazing. But AI, I'm weak on it. And it's not that I don't think it's important, it's just that I have not had time to really sit and think about it. However, I'm going to go by the seat of my pants and say that AI is going to be good at both. And I know that because this is more name dropping, and once again, it's random. It's not that I hang out in these circles, but I once was sitting at a table with Bill Gates. It was actually at his house, and he was showing me, right before all this started, he was showing me the new toy. And on the one hand, I have seen ChatGPT reproducing the slangiest language. I mean, some of my students have included it in their work, with a different font, and thought that I wouldn't figure it out. But then, on the other hand, what Bill did was he said, look at what this can do. And he told it, life is not all about me, but this is what he did. Write an editorial in the style of John McWhorter about reparations for slavery. And he went, doink. And it wasn't anything I've ever actually written, but it came out, and it was in that kind of Wall Street Journal language. I don't write about that anymore, but it was in the language. It was reproducing it perfectly. Like, it was, the editors of the Wall Street Journal, it's in there. And then he told it, write it in Russian. And so it went, doink. And there's a Russian person next to me, and I said, what kind of Russian? And she said, not only is it highly formal Russian, but it sounds like the way you would write if you were Russian. So that is what I think it can do, but I want us to move into the future. Let's pretend that this is a year from now when I've actually put the clarinet down, and I'll be able to give you a more intelligent answer. I'm so sorry.
Could I see some hands from maybe some of our high schoolers or people in the middle who have had their hand up for quite some time after that gentleman speaks?
My question has to do with the apps that are out there, the Rosetta Stones and the Babels of the world. How are they integrating the range of the high and the low into how they train people that are traveling to or integrating into another country?
Those apps all suck. But it's really, they're such a ripoff. I'm often asked to try them out. I've never seen one that understood that there's H and L, partly because you're usually taught that later, I think later than you should be, and those apps always get you to the point where you could roughly get off the plane and say that you were in pain. That's about all that you can say. So no, and I think that better apps like that would be much more conscious of the HL distinction much earlier. It's something that I've always wanted to know right from the beginning. But Duolingo, I gave it to my daughter, my 13-year-old, and she's supposed to be teaching herself Spanish, didn't learn a thing, and part of it was because all they were teaching her was how to say, my uncle is a lawyer, but my aunt has a spoon. But that's not a useful sentence. I don't mean to be facile either. Those apps suck. It's just awful.
Hello. I wanted to say that this lecture, it really gave voice to a lot of things that I just kind of know already, coming from obviously a bilingual household. Mm-hmm. So that was really cool. Just and even when I go back to India, what I read and the way I hear people speak, and they just constantly mix English into their words. It's just really cool to see that that's an actual thing. But my question is, with the greater acceptance of there being multiple ways to speak English, what would you say is the best way to preserve, in America, which is largely homogenized the way we speak the language, what do you think is the best way to preserve lesser known dialects of English? For example, the Appalachian, Cherokee dialect of English, or something like that. What do you think is the best way to preserve that and maintain and educate people about the language diversity that we actually have in this country?
I know the answer that I'm supposed to give, and I've tried. I'm not seeing it. I'm going to give you the honest answer, which is that with the non-standard dialects that are disappearing, our job is to use the technology that we have to record as deeply as possible what it was like, because once it's on its way out, it is very hard to get it to the point that it's being spoken to children, toddlers again. And that's the thing. You can sit some people in a classroom and say this and say that, but especially with a dialect, you have to speak it. And when you have a small child, you're tired. And so you're going to speak what's easiest. And so I'm not sure that these things work unless it's organically surviving. And so, for example, the data is out on whether Gullah Creole is on its way out. Some people say it's doing just fine. Some people say it's leaving. I hope that it's doing fine because you can't preserve it by saying this is wonderful. There's just no way. And I feel bad about that because there's so many great languages disappearing. And honestly, the sad thing is this. People started thinking about language death, and by extension, dialect death. It's about 1979 that linguists got word, and then there are all these efforts. And unless the language has a very long, strong written tradition, and also a considerable number of people who are still speaking it, I don't think there's any way to bring a language back such that people are growing up speaking. And the reason I don't think so is because it's been 50 years, and there has not been a single successful effort. And I think after a while, you have to realize that teaching teenagers and people in their 40s bits and pieces of the language is kind of like my uncle is a lawyer and my aunt. And so I don't mean to be pessimistic, but that's why it's so sad how much is disappearing. But what we can do is we can record this stuff more richly than we could even 20 years ago. Stick the microphone, well, as if it's all about a microphone now, stick your phone in somebody's face, gather, learn to speak the language halfway yourself and make it so that at least we know what it was like. And then, and this is already happening with AI can kind of make it up again, and then maybe we can talk about playing it for babies, but that's going to be a whole different thing. But you can make AI speak a language that you threw into it, and so that'll help too. Although what AI speaks will never be quite what it was. And so, for example, this is the only one I can think of. It's so unpleasant, but it's useful. To die, like to expire, and then the expression dying off. And so somebody will say, well, that generation, they're all died off. Okay, what did die off mean? You use it in that very specific aspect. It's people in the neighborhood who are of a certain age. Die off implies a certain sympathy and affection. Even if you've gathered 10,000 words of English, the AI isn't going to know how to use die off, but maybe a subtraction is better than nothing. That's the long answer to that. I wish I could be sunnier about it, but.
Thank you.
I'm going to need some audience help. Could y'all help me recognize people who have had their hand up for a while?
I've got a big bright light. I can't tell. Ooh, it's the middle.
Hi, I'm also from the Blair Linguistics Club.
Montgomery Blair,
we're big fans, clearly. And you mentioned style switching, and that's really interesting. I was wondering, to what extent is that intentional or unintentional, and do people realize that they're doing it? Because I know, for example, that me and my siblings all make fun of my mom, because when she's talking to someone with an accent, she subconsciously and without knowing that she's doing it will sort of adopt like a little bit of that accent, that sort of style that she's doing. So what would you say is the extent that it's unintentional or that people realize they're doing it?
All right, I'm going to give you the goodly answer, and I'm going to give you what I think the answer is. People in academia, in linguistics and anthropology especially, think that style shifting is something that people do more or less deliberately, that you're shaping an identity. I get the appeal of that idea, but I don't feel it. I don't see the evidence for it. I think style shifting is mostly subconscious, which to me is what makes it so interesting. It's just like we walk subconsciously. I think people don't, your mother doesn't know that she's all of a sudden sounding German or whatever this accent is. And, even with Matt Rife, I don't think he does that on purpose. He's been probably doing that since he was 7. Apparently he had a couple of black friends. And so he doesn't know. It's just hard to listen to. And so style shifting, I think, is something that people just do because that's what's in their head and we subconsciously accommodate to other people. If we asked Alison Stewart, do you know you sound blacker with black guests? I don't know her, but I'll bet she would say, I do, but yet she do. So that was good.
I'm going to pass it to this gentleman over here if you could help me out.
Thank you very much. Fascinating lecture. First of all, I hope you
Where is this
approve
person?
my imitation of the Italian accent. I'm working hard on that. And the other thing, I always was fascinated by the fact that, as you mentioned, Dante Alighieri was instrumental in steering the Italian language the way it is today. And he did that by writing 2 essays. One was Il dolce stil novo, the new sweet style, written in Italian, and the other, De vulgaris eloquentia, the people speech, written in Latin. And I find it interesting that he felt, in order to be taken seriously, he had to write the main essay in H language, in Latin. I wonder what you think about that.
That's one of those Archaeopteryx moments. Archaeopteryx is this fossil that's in between a reptile and a bird. It's this bird with teeth and a tail. And so that means that something that looks kind of like a velociraptor became a bird. Archaeopteryx is right in between. So he is somebody who clearly has a rather competent command of Italian, but he's still thinking at that time that the real language, at least for other people, is Latin, whereas nobody writing in Italy today would think of it that way. That's the last blink of that. And you can see it in various circumstances, the Odes of Strasbourg, much earlier than that, in France, where you have a Latin version of what they're saying, and then they've translated into Latin because the real language they use is clearly early French. And there's a high and a low. It probably wasn't even called French yet. It's interesting to see those moments because Romance is one of the cases where the L was accepted because of the development of the nation state as the new H. But that's not what usually happens. And so Moroccan Arabic is considered Arabic, but it's not that only Moroccan Arabic is spoken and modern standard Arabic is only in books. That hasn't happened because of a different geopolitical trajectory. But yeah, the Romance languages have been, in a way, eccentric that way, because of the nation state, particularly in Europe at that particular time.
Hi, I'm also from the Montgomery Blair Linguistics Club. I found your talk really interesting. I really appreciated it. But I was wondering, you kind of hinted at this in your presentation, the cultural impacts. And so, like when you were talking about, oh, I have to go grab my bags versus my parcels, and like the accent change between American and like British English, and how I feel like, at least in America, British English is kind of viewed as high or like H language, and like it's kind of viewed as more snooty, even like in olden times, to even like after we had like the cultural changes that you mentioned, after like the 1950s and World War II, when essentially we're at the same point of like power in the world, and how like, is it because that like British English has, or like Britain has been like around longer as a country itself, and is like that the reason that we, and it's American, and like even British people view like British English as like H language versus like American English is lower?
Yeah, that's a unique circumstance. We do think of British English as posh, as somehow better, but we don't speak it and we don't produce it. It's just something that we hear. And so it's a kind of a subsidiary H-ness. And you can get into some fine grades of how H and L work with some M's in between. And so we hear it that way that the Harry Potter characters talk, etc. But we don't do it. And another thing is, I'm not British, but they don't hear us as L as they used to, is my impression, because we dominate the media the way we do. And so it's a more horizontal relationship. The funny thing about the world is that if you blew everything up and started again, or a Martian came down, real English is Indian English, because there are more of them speaking English than Britain and Americans combined. And so the idea that theirs is something other is kind of an artificial circumstance. But I take your point about British English. We like to hear it, but we don't speak it, and I don't think we want to. I don't want to speak it, and so it's just nice to hear it.
How about up here? In front? Yeah, you, jacket.
Jacket.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking here. I'm a huge fan as well.
Thank you.
One when you talked about Matt Rife, I'm actually a fan. So
I knew we were going to get stuck on him.
No, because it reminds me of, like, so I'm from Queens, New York, and my friends.
Which neighborhood?
College Point, Whitestone.
Oh, yes, the Target, the BJ's.
Yes. So growing up, you know, my friends, my Asian friends, you know, they speak a certain way, and I would say it moves towards the L, and I would say it speaks more, let's say, urban, if you want to use that term. Urban. So the question for me when you're talking about Matt Rife, it was like a really interesting question to me. It's like, at what point can one, I guess, way of speaking is licensed to someone else, and it's maybe more universally accepted, and it's deemed not like, oh, you're stealing. So how would you determine that? And it's pretty complex in my mind.
I know what you mean in terms of Asian, especially boys and men in Queens, where really, frankly, the dialect that I'm guessing that this is also use among one another is indistinguishable from Black English often. That has become your language. That is also true of many South Asian kids these days. That's definitely true. The Filipinos got in on it early. I think that that's just an indication, and I think you can overstate it, that Black English has become youth lingua franca. And I don't know, the Montgomery Blair woman might feel differently. I don't know who would resent that. Like, I've had students at Columbia who write to me, you know, here in the 2020s. They grew up speaking this fluently with their friends, and they text in it, and they understand that there's a little bit of a delicate issue there because they're not Black, but vocally, I wouldn't know they weren't. For example, Aziz Ansari, the comedian. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, he would have been thought of as the Indian guy who sounds Black. Now I don't think anybody much thinks about it. That's just normal. With Matt Rife, I think part of the issue is that he didn't grow up in College Point, Queens, or anywhere where he was immersed that way. He had a couple of pals for a while. And so he has learned to do a very good imitation of something, and I'm sure that now it's as natural to him as it is for us to smack our legs together when we feel food falling down on the floor. I mean, it's a conditioned reflex. But it seems a little... But when I have an issue with him, I don't have an issue with Aziz Ansari, put it that way.
Hi. To tag on to the music question, if for a community chorus, singing spirituals, Porgy and Bess, how do you explain that it's okay to sing the music on the page with the words on the page and it's not an insult?
Is there really a question?
Sometimes this happens.
All right. What did George and Ira Gershwin and DuBose Hayward, who are all white men, what did they not know that we know now? So, I got plenty of nuttin'. How dare you say got and nuttin'? You're not Black. Really? I think that, especially with music, just do it. I mean, I think, frankly, it's less in people's faces than just speaking. And Porgy and Bess is literally some of the best music ever written. You can't say community chorus, don't do it. If you're going to do Bess, You Is My Woman Now, and you don't have a Black guy or something like that, do it. It's just such good music. And frankly, Ira and DuBose got almost nothing wrong. Yeah, it's one thing if you're making something up minstrel style, but DuBose was almost kind of an honorary Black person himself and not in the Matt Rife way. Ira just sat around smoking his pipe, but he did a good imitation because they were New Yorkers and they both had great respect for Black art. I would say if you're talking about Porgy and Bess, that's sacred. You have to just do it. And Porgy and Bess is not just ours. Porgy and Bess is the world's. Do it. Just do it.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It seems to me that a pretty crucial point of it is the idea that the H and the L, or the several classic versions of how to say something, have the exact same meaning. And so they're only different on the surface. I'm curious if you think, from a cognitive perspective, that there's some possibility or some level to which the construal of the speaker has an effect, or whether these really represent or are affected by different conceptualizations of the same thing. And if you think that that's possibly present, how does that affect the study of this? How does this affect the grander idea?
They don't mean the same thing, H and L. There is a slight lack of fit. When you say it in L, you're conveying different shades than you're conveying if you say it in H. And I think that's part of why it's been said that H has less feeling. Who was it? Norman Podhoretz, a controversial, I guess now conservative commentator, said in the 60s that the way he had learned to communicate went out of style because he said he felt like to be articulate was to have no feelings. And by articulate, he meant speaking H. He didn't know that you can be articulate in the L as well, but he was getting at that. I want to say that aspect of things, where what are the pragmatic construals of H and L in diglossia, I want to say that it hasn't been studied, but then again, I haven't really been looking, and so maybe people have gotten on to that. Yi-Ting, maybe you know something. But it should be studied, because it's not just as simple as ice cream in H and ice cream in L. And that's also part of why somebody like Matt Rife, let's just stick with him, can be irritating, because in using the dialect in that way, he's not saying just exactly what he would have said in the H. He's taking on also aspects of a cultural orientation, which maybe a group of South Asian and Vietnamese American kids actually have, but that he, with his middle-class self, doesn't. And so that's that sort of thing. Yeah, that needs to be done more.
Are there any other questions?
What do you hope we do with what you said?
What was all that? This is what I want you to do with it. I don't know how you personally hear speech, but my mission here has been to do two things. One, to give us all a sense that we might speak in different ways rather than just slipping now and then, or there's a way I talk with mom, that we have two things, just like people in Switzerland have two things. Two, also to be less inclined to listen to people speaking something other than the standard and think, what's up with that, rather than, isn't that cool? Those two things were the mission. Other than, I didn't know he was going to come up at all, but the main point was just thinking, golly, Switzerland, golly, the Kaman hunter-gatherers, golly, we're just like that, but we just don't know it. Let's listen to NPR, and here's one of my favorite old cartoons. That was the point.
Well, on that note,
let's thank that's a good ending note. Thank you, folks. What happens now?
I have some announcements.
Okay.
Would you like to come with me?
I'm coming with you.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. We have just a few more orders of business. I have some... All right. I have to announce some winners of our raffle, our signed book raffle. So please, if I say your name, please come forward to the stage so that you can collect your book. It's Minion Shao, Ethan Zhao, Matt Goupel, Tanya Bleem, and Carolina Walker. So if I called your name, please come up to get a book. I also have many people to thank for this event. This event was co-sponsored by the Maryland Language Science Center and the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, linguistics as well. The funding came from ARHU and BSOS. Many thanks to Naya Lee Hendricks, our LSC comms coordinator, Caitlin Eves, Hoda Mahmoudi, Kate Seaman, Rochelle Nelson, and let's see. Rochelle Nelson and Kate Mooney, and Eusebia Mont. Thank you so much for all of you guys for coming out here, and have a nice day.